When life throws you a curveball, how are you going to handle adversity? Welcome to the Fearless Mindset Podcast, where you're about to go on a journey as I interview security, business, and entertainment leaders on what it takes to stay fearless. I'm your host, Mark Ledlow, and enjoy today's episode. Here, Fred, here's a question that I've been asked a lot of is there a serious threat with, the open border issue with all those migrants coming in over the border over the last 4 years? And I think what's the total, I've heard numbers of 8 million, 10 million people that came across from who knows where. And there's probably some, isolated by potential terrorist cells within that crowd of people that came over. Is that actually accurate information, or is that fear mongering, or what's your thoughts on all that?
It's a great question, Mark. And I probably have been asked that question a lot in the 20, 25 years since I've been in this business as well. And, the interesting aspect when you look at this is, to the best of my knowledge, there never has been a domestic act of terror directly linked to a transnational terrorist coming from the southern border.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. So if you're looking at it from a pure analytical perspective, I'm just talking terrorism. I'm not talking crime. That's
okay. Sure.
If you go and step into the criminal, however you want to define that, and leaving out terrorism, there's plenty of examples of that. And I'm not saying it's not a national security problem. What I'm saying is there hasn't been evidence of that taking place.
Wow.
We've had planes flown into buildings, as we all know.
Yeah.
We've had bad visa issuances and immigration problems going back to getting, Al-Qaeda terrorists in a pre-9/11 environment into the United States. So time will tell on that, whether or not that's a legitimate concern. Is it reasonable to assume that we've had intelligence operatives from various host government security services that have inserted operatives into the United States? It's probably a reasonable assumption to assume. Having said that, if you're a nation state actor, you could create documents and you could create fraudulent identities, and you don't really need to slip into the border. You could just come right in on an aircraft. So,
right.
It's one of these kinds of questions that gets very political depending upon who you ask.
Absolutely.
Your mindset is also one that is going to drive whatever reaction might be as it pertains to that. Having said that, is it reasonable to assume that we've let some those associated with terrorist organizations in? It sure is. Having said that, we have not seen an act of terror perpetrated by these individuals thus far. And I think thus far is the key statement.
Thus far. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. That's the biggest question I keep on getting asked by different people. What's the threats? I'm like, hard to say. Until something happens, we just don't know. May take him through 3 or 4 years, and by that time, Trump's leaving office, and the new administration comes in every 4 years, and it's just how our government runs every 4 years.
Well, we've certainly seen plots. Meaning, when you start look at this, we certainly had the Iranian plot out of Mexico City a few years back, where they were planning on trying to target the Saudi ambassador to the United States in Washington, D.C. Right. And that was all thwarted out of Mexico. I believe that was under the Obama administration. That's how far back that goes.
Right.
And, I've seen some data sets on Iran watchers that the Iranians have, tried to go after dissidents here in the United States. There was a notorious one from a blogger up in New York City, but that individual did not come through the southern border. So when you start looking at it from an analytical perspective, you really got to kind of nail down how did that individual get here? Where did they come from? And so forth. And so, one of the more interesting, intriguing things that I'm looking at, we recently had the horrific incident up in Vermont where the Border Patrol agent was shot and killed on a traffic stop, which apparently you had 2 threat actors. The female was from Washington State, and there was a German national, and they were loaded out with all kinds of weapons and tactical gear and NVG and vests and everything. What were they up to, and what was their intended plans? And as you look at that, I kind of harken back that was right out of kind of like the playbook from some of the old leftist terrorist groups that we saw in Europe in the 70s. So, will we see a resurgence of that kind of terror here in the United States? That's something that, thus far we don't really know what their intended motive was for all these weapons and killing the Border Patrol agent. So, to me, that's the kind of potential emerging trend that I have an eye out, but we haven't seen any follow-up incidents, and we haven't seen really any explanations come out of the FBI as to what they were up to. And then obviously, we're still engaged with, I think our nation has become, I'm sad to say, immune to the endless school shooter threat, Mark.
Oh, good point. Very good point.
And I think for those of us in the protection space, protectors, especially protectors that have children that you're trying to protect as they go to their schools, whether it be public or private, or even college. I know a lot of our teams, a lot of our colleagues have teams that are out there that protect kids. That's one thing that I don't think we can lose sight of when it comes to that, because the tempo of those attacks far outpace anything we've seen from a domestic terrorism perspective.
Easily, yeah. School shootings are like every other week we're having a school shooting somewhere.
It really has become. There's an interesting phenomenon. We used to, even back in the day when I was running protective intelligence operations to the State Department, there's a threat fatigue that sets in, and I don't know if you saw this in the Marine Corps, where it's just another threat, right?
Right.
When isn't this group trying not to kill us, right?
Yeah.
It's like an endless stream of incidents. And I think what's happened to us as a nation, Mark, is in the school shooting space, we become immune to that. That's just another one.
Right.
And we don't think much about it. Yeah. But it's one of these phenomena that, to me, is much more troubling and dangerous than what we've seen from the domestic terrorism perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the focus has been put on domestic terrorism versus the school shootings and psychological profiling and maybe counseling these kids that are showing signs of needing help, therapy. But I think I would agree with that. Maybe it should be some government funding towards schools so they, if people are showing some signs of duress or stress from home, maybe mom and dad going through a divorce and maybe they're just depressed, anxiety. It seems like there's a high anxiety issue within school system more than ever before. I mean, when I was in school, anxiety wasn't really an issue, I don't think, but back then, because you didn't have social media pressures.
Right, and I think you're right. I mean, as a child, I was alive when JFK was assassinated, and but remember too, our news vehicles were very limited in those days. We had pretty much 3 news channels, and you had to wait for the morning paper to figure out what happened. And I can remember acts of terrorism in the 80s overseas where diplomats were killed that might get 3 or 4 lines in the New York Times or the Washington Post at best. And it's just a different world that we're living in today. So, again, that's
social media.
I think it's made our job tougher. I think it's made our job tougher as protectors. And I think it's made our job tougher specifically from an analytical perspective to try to make sense of all these threats. It's like endless rounds of buckshot coming at you, right? And you got to make sure to catch the ones that are going to help you make sense of the bigger picture.
Right. Yeah, then we also have, the geopolitical side of things right now. New administration, we're looking at the issue with Ukraine, Russia, and then from a business standpoint, where people are going to be spending their money and their time. And you got, China flexing their muscles on, the Philippines and the Taiwan Straits and all that. That's an ongoing thing for years and years and years. That's China playing the long game over there.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and I think for us here domestically, I assume most of the bulk of your clients or business are domestic. Mm-hmm. Having said that, there's probably some international trips. I did a talk for local law enforcement, local, state, and federal law enforcement not too long ago. And I always make this point, what happens abroad resonates here domestically. We saw that with some of these pro-Palestinian demonstrations. We've seen that historically. I mean, Sirhan assassinated Robert F. Kennedy to raise awareness for Palestinian rights. Those are the kinds of incidents, that drive protection inside the United States. And so it's important for us to be aware of them. But, you look at this from a geopolitical perspective, and to your point, you've got the hot war and the covert war underway in the Ukraine. Time will tell if President Trump will be able to get Putin and Zelensky to sit down and come to some sort of agreement there. Certainly things have seemed to have simmered down a little bit in Gaza, and the war efforts there. I think the Israelis really took the fight to Hezbollah and kind of decapitated the leadership there to the point that I'm not so sure they can recover from that.
Wow, that was severe.
Yeah, and then you raise, the very good point. The South China Sea has always been one of those hot spots. Even when I was in the State Department in the 80s, It was something we watched very, very closely. So, it's interesting dynamic. The one thing that I've always been surprised at, though, Mark, is that usually events unfold in the geopolitical space that we're not anticipating. And I don't know why. We've got some very smart people in the intelligence community, and you can look at the world, and you can usually kind of forecast where nation states might try to make a move on another nation. But we've really never been that good at forecasting that on a reality basis.
Yeah.
And I still, for the life of me, find it hard to believe, knowing the state of Israel and the work I've done there and some of the investigations I've conducted there, that, Hamas and PIJ and Hezbollah and Iran were able to surprise the Israelis with the attack because, after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel put stopgaps and tripwires in place for that never to happen again. And yet here it's happened again.
Wow.
And so the one thing that I worry about from that aspect is think about, I don't know when you joined the Marine Corps. Was it post 9/11?
Yeah, I got out a week after 9/11. So I got very lucky. 9/11 happened a week. And the week after I got out of college, graduated, and then went to the mailbox and got my honorable discharge from the United States Marine Corps in an envelope. And I was done. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Really? So
wow.
I got lucky.
Well, thank you for your service. No finer military organization in the world than the United States Marine Corps. But you look at how long ago 9/11 was. And literally, Mark, we have a generation now that's ancient history.
Ancient history, right?
Ancient history ago. Right. Not, is it modern day history? It depends on how you define that. And, for someone like me who was born when President Eisenhower was president, and you think in general what he came out of, with the wars, and you try to look at that in context from a historical perspective, our nation seems to always be surprised. And I want to believe that we're better today at anticipating surprise, but history has shown we're not. And I don't know the reason for that, Mark. I mean, you can look historically, we're not very good at anticipating surprise.
Even with AI and modern day AI, they can't forecast with robots.
I've heard a lot of speculation and discussion inside the IC surrounding that maybe we can get in front of this with AI. Maybe we can, but if you look historically, we've just not been good at that.
Is there any other nation states that have been good at it? Israel, maybe?
No,
I didn't even see that coming.
yeah, if they saw it coming, it hasn't been explained as to what happened.
Yeah,
And
bizarre. I
you know,
mean, I
you
was
can
shocked when that happened. I was like, "This is the IDF. This is Israel. They're the best intelligence force in the world." And whoa, I was taken back.
right, and you can go back to I'm just blanking on the name of their 9/11 commission
Yeah.
after the 73 war, and they said we can't let this happen again, and yet it did.
Yeah.
And you look at us, whether it be Pearl Harbor, 9/11, missiles at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, just being able to forecast nation state activity. Now, having said that, I've not seen a lot of reporting on whether or not we forecasted, meaning we, the U.S. government, forecasted Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Maybe there were some smart folks that saw that coming, but Russia still rolled in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The biggest thing right now I'm concerned about is, Putin maybe going nuke World War III on NATO. What's your thoughts on that? You think that's a possibility, or is that just
I don't. And the reason I say that is I think at the end of the day, Putin is a rational actor. I don't think you get to be a head of state, even in a place like Russia, by having some degree of rationality when it comes to some of your decision making. And for students interested in this, there's a great book by my friend Andy Jacobson out. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's called Nuclear War, a Scenario. And if you don't want to sleep for a week, Mark, or if your viewers don't want to sleep for a week, read that book. It's called A Nuclear War, a Scenario, because it shows you how quick the world goes to hell in a handbasket in the event of a nuclear move by anybody. It also paints some frightening decision making, how long it takes for anybody to make a decision. And I read it, and even having worked at the Secret Service and the State Department and so forth, and being over at the agency, I learned some things in there, and I said, "Oh my God, you got to be kidding me! We don't have this." And so it also, I thought, was very applicable to the type of work we do. Meaning, at the end of the day, you exist to protect your clients, people, places, property, families. And it was a reminder to me about the importance of people and process, and just SOPs. And making sure that the SOPs and your processes are truly up to date, are truly rational, and are fact-based. Not that I'm hoping that it can only take me 5 minutes to get a VIP to a hospital. Are you sure it's not 12 minutes? You know what I mean? It really made me start thinking about all the times in my career, both in the public sector and the private sector, that we were just flying by the seats of our pants.
Absolutely.
And I think that a lot of us, especially in the executive protection space, still fly by the seat of our pants, if truth be told.
And it's a responsive knee-jerk reaction of reacting to whatever stimulus you're given, behaviors you're responding to. You're always reacting in this industry. It's always a response, and it's never pre-thought of, because nobody wants to spend the money for you to, spend the money to do a case and create a case and actually do your due diligence. Nobody wants to spend money on it. It's always a reactor every time.
So you think that boils down to money?
Every time. And someone explained to me the best that if you look at a corporate budget, line item budget, the bottom line budget is janitorial services, and typically executive security services is below janitorial services. I'm like, oh, that is a problem.
Well, that's one of the things that you would hope that in light of like the Brian Thompson murder, that,
Mm-hmm.
and I do think that companies, I think that was a wake up call for CEOs.
So had to be.
I think it was a wake up call for boards.
Wow.
I've spoken to boards. I think folks
Mm-hmm.
want to know what more can we do. But to your point, I still think there's a lot of challenges in this business when it comes to reality-based protection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to put adequate resources in place to just do the bare minimum.
Because I don't think people see the value. The C-suite don't see the value in investing in a team because they don't want to have their privacy invaded. They don't want that invasiveness of some stranger in their life that watch their every move they make in public. They just, I mean, if I had a bodyguard, like I'm a Marine, I got a sidearm, I got a CCW, I don't need no bodyguard. That'd be my instant response. And then you have a culture from the West Coast. After spending some time across country the last 5 months, it's kind of cool to have a protected team, especially if you're a tech. If you're in LA, it's kind of cool. But man, you go to the Texas where your guys are at in Ontic or Dallas, those good old boys, they got their sidearm, and I don't need no bodyguard. I got my sidearm, I got my cowboy hat, and I got my big old truck, and I'm running over you. It's just it's a different mindset across the country. It's what I've seen. It's just like the boys and the men are men in the Texas, and they got their gun, and no one's going to bother them. It's just it's a mindset. And the West Coast is like, I need a bodyguard, and I want a bodyguard. It's more of the status thing. Do they really need bodyguard protection? I don't know. But that's kind of what I've observed.
Well, I think it gets back to it's really it's an analytical and an academic kind of argument. And for when I look at this, and I spoke to a very young billionaire not too long ago. His career was much better than mine, right? And he said, "Well, I'm now worth all this money."
Sure.
And I said, "Well, there's a lot of people with money." "Well, I'm just worried about." I said, "What are you really worried about?" And he said, "Well, I'm worried about my family." "Okay, let's talk a little bit about that."
Sure.
Let's talk about some things we can do to put your mind at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that at times what happens is folks do get bad advice, Mark, in our business, meaning
I see that.
You and I both know that not every detail needs to have a limousine, a lead, a follow,
right.
K9, EOD dogs, and
not necessary.
Right. But we all know that there are some CEOs and some folks that do need all that for whatever reason.
Absolutely.
They're in the media every day or whatever. It's threat driven. But so I think at times we do our own selves a disservice by not honestly listening to some clients and saying, help me understand what really is driving your concerns here. And you just might need a Chevrolet versus a Cadillac kind of operation here.
Yeah, that's simple.
It could be that simple. And, hey, I just want somebody to keep an eye on my family or my wife or my kids or my significant other. Well, that's kind of easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that hard.
No.
And I've watched and just seen the weight of the world come off of some executives' shoulders when you just kind of tell them, look, everything's going to be okay. We've got a good team here. I need your trust and confidence that I've got things well in hand. And trust me, you'll be the first one to know if I uncover something that you really need to be concerned about, you or your family.
Well, you said something that's key there, Fred. They trust you. And that trust is, are you there to be in a business trying to get money out of them so they spend money on you, or you're protecting their asset, you're protecting their investments, and that's part of security, protecting their brand, protecting their business. And if they know you have their best interests in mind and not spending money on you because it's really not a need, you're not selling fear to them, which I see a lot of boutique companies out there selling fear and proposing fear. We did a threat assessment. here's all these fear analysis, and they're not really there. And it gives the industry a bad name when you're trying to sell a fear product to a company and they really don't need it. And then they get a bad taste in their mouth. And I see a lot of that out.
Yeah, well, that's I appreciate that observation. That's sad to hear. I remember a few years ago, myself and my old dear friend and colleague Scott Stewart, we wrote a threat assessment on the threat to children of high net worth parents, and because we were consistently talking to a string of billionaires that their number one concern was, I'm worried about my kids being kidnapped.
Absolutely.
And we said, okay, well, let's think about this for a minute. Let's look at some historical cases and let's talk through the practical reality of that. And that, when you look at it from just a fact basis, there's not a lot of kidnappings of ultra high net worth children on a reality basis. Yes, there have been some going back to the Lindbergh baby, right? But in reality, they've been few and far between. And every parent's fear is that, when daddy or mommy sends little Johnny or Jane out to school, they're worried about. Having said that, I would think the majority of folks today are worried about a school shooting versus a kidnapping.
Yeah.
At least in conversations that I've had. So, I really like to see, and I really have been grateful to look at the evolution of protective intelligence applications and analysts in our space, because you could put a little bit of analytical rigor around some of the decisions. And I think it also makes the client, the protectee, the family, the CEO, recognize that you've approached this problem logically. Mm-hmm. You're not trying to throw, them into an fully armored vehicle when they, in all reality, probably don't need that. But you're keeping an eye on them at public events, making sure they get safely from point A to point B, and so forth. I mean, let me ask you a question. Do you think that a close protection, just one close protection officer would have made a difference in the Brian Thompson case?
No, needed to in that situation.
I agree with you. And so you look at that kind of incident and think through that tactically, one to either be a close protection, advance, or shadow, however you're going to run that, detail. But, those are the kinds of just logical kind of decisions that I think we all make in this business. And I think CEOs today, in light of that, are almost more receptive to that kind of low-key kind of protection.
Well, I mean, case studies say that, most hits on these executives are leaving the house, going to work and arriving at work, and leaving work and going to home. That's usually when that executive or CEO is most vulnerable, is when they're in that transit.
Absolutely. And that follows even data research that we did with the government going back through the 60s and the 70s, whether it be political assassinations or kidnappings. Most notably your point of departure in the morning, or your point of departure from your work environment, whether that be an office or an embassy or whatever. Yep. And so, you can ebb and flow your counter surveillance efforts, predicated upon that.
Right.